So we're gonna start by laying down a basic figure. We're going to use standard proportions that costume designers use, which are a little bit different than fashion proportions. A fashion figure is generally 9 heads tall because costume designers are a little more based in reality. We generally use a 7.5 to 8 head tall figure. I'm going to go ahead and do a really simple thing here and show you a trick that's necessary for beginners when they're laying down an initial figure so that they can check their proportions and make sure that they aren't drawing people with legs that are too long or arms that are too long. And so each one of these units that I just measured off is a head in height. So I'm going to draw a little head up here in the first little box that I marked off. Not sure if we can see that because the picture's very blown out. Let's draw a little darker. Okay. Now can we see it? Sort of. Okay. So I'm using a 2B, which is actually for me a very soft pencil. Because I usually like to lay down the skeleton of a figure in a very light line because I'm a costume designer, so I'm going to draw clothes on top of it. So I usually draw the body and the posture and the stance of the figure very light so that I can then draw the clothes with more clarity of line on top of it. So I'm going to draw a little darker than I normally would so that the camera can see this. I'm going to lay out the form in some basic simple shapes. So the head occupies one of the first units. I marked out 8. I drew a straight line so that I would have basically a gravitational pull line for the figure to stand on. It also helps in placing the spine and balancing the figure. We're going to do a simple figure right now. I've laid out kind of a squished little egg shape that's a little wider at the top that will be the waist up to shoulder point of the upper torso. If we say our head is here, I've got a little dash point, another head measurement down. That's usually like the breast point or the chest circumference line. The next point is the waist or the belly button area. Next point down is the bottom of the torso or the seat. So I've laid out the trunk. Most people are 7.5 heads tall, so I've measured 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm gonna make my person a little bit longer because, well, they'll be a little more stretched out, and I might put them in a big dress and it might just give me more space to work them out. So I'm gonna put some leg directional lines and arm lines. I'm gonna go ahead and let them put their hand on their hip. I'm not gonna worry about the hands just yet. I am going to go ahead and create a little triangular shape that will give me like a foot direction. This hand is on the hip, so I'm just going to use some gestural shapes to mark in where the hand goes. But it should be pointed out that the elbows usually line up with the point the waist falls on. So this is the elbow juncture. So they kind of follow a similar radius that they swing off of. Hands generally come down just a bit past the seat. They usually fall to somewhere in this leg that I've put down. We'll go ahead and break it down. But the knee is generally somewhere in this head placement. There's the lower leg. The hand usually comes off of the lower arm or the forearm, somewhere in correlation to the bottom of the torso. Some people have longer arms. Some almost come down to the kneecaps. A good point to place them at is coming down to somewhere in the mid to high thigh. So I'm going to go ahead and place a hand here. If anything, hands look better sort of lengthened than they do shortened. So if you were going to err on one side or the other, it'd be better to create a longer, more fluid arm. Just looks better in a fashion drawing. Okay, so I've kind of laid out a basic figure. This person is sort of walking. And actually this leg will go ahead and do sort of in semi-profile. They're both a little in profile. I guess we can point out that the kneecap actually protrudes, as does the upper leg. The lower leg sits just a little bit back. from the upper leg. So generally the kneecap is going to extend forward, and the lower leg actually will kind of kick back a little bit, kind of stretch these guys out. So we've got a skeleton of a figure here. I'm already past the point actually where I'm ready to draw clothes. I'm gonna do a dress because that will allow me to do more drapery. So I'm gonna sculpt out a little bit more of the waist so that I can create like an hourglass to work with. And let's go ahead, I'm gonna make this like a high necked kind of, let's go ahead and do a circle skirt because we're in a pandemic and we're talking about 6 foot radius. So let's draw actually a fashion that maybe would help us keep people 6 feet away from us. Why not? So this is gonna be a high neck thing. I'm gonna draw a yoke on it, a yoke line. Maybe a little ruffle. I'm making this up. I'm gonna give a style line that will show that there's a point of attachment for a high neck collar. I'm gonna suggest there's a little ruffle there as well. I'm gonna give this kind of a slightly high waist. Maybe scoop it up a little bit. And let's go ahead and give it maybe a waist yoke that drops a little. I'm gonna do something that has some soft gathering so that we have a reason to draw some small folds. So in a drawing at this point, we anticipate using either marker or paint to go on top of it. So most of these lines will be lost, and they are just kind of like blueprints or like a map to tell me where I'm going to place shadows, highlights, things like that later in the coloring, rendering, and painting process. Let's give it kind of a bell shape. I'm gonna make it out of something sort of fine that will allow me to do a lot of soft falls and gathers. Drapery is important in rendering a garment because the folds of the fabric, whether or not they're coming out towards the light or receding away from it, that's what defines the architecture of the cloth in a drawing, as well as the actual shape of the garment that we're looking at. I'm gonna give this maybe a slightly wider shoulder, something like an 1840s look, and maybe I'm gonna drop the bodice a little bit off of the shoulder here. Something that you would see in either the 1950s, 60s, or parts of the Victorian era, although we're making this dress up, it's not historically accurate. I'm gonna give it a sleeve that's a semi-puff sleeve that gathers gently into that upper sleeve area. Probably somebody wearing this dress wouldn't be with their hand on their hip, but we're gonna keep going with that. So with the amount of gathering that I have suggested here, this garment would have to be made out of something pretty fine. So to have that kind of frequency of gathers without a really larger, bulkier shape coming out of it, it would have to be like a chiffon, maybe a silk charmeuse, a one-ply silk, or something like a cotton voile, which is like a sheer, like somewhat see-through and very, very lightweight cotton with a very open weave. It might be used for something like a day dress or a children's dress in the modern day. Right now we would use it in spring for sundresses. So let's go with something like that. I'm gonna let that one foot peek out a little bit. It's always good, even on a floor length dress, to show a foot for scale and for reference. Like that's how we know whether it's sort of touching the ground or if it's at the ankle or something like that. So by covering one foot and showing one peeking out, it's basically telling us that it's touching the ground, but she's in movement. Even though this is supposed to be going towards a drapery discussion and study, I'm gonna go ahead and suggest a face, ears, with the garment I've given her. I'm gonna sketch in something that might be kind of like Little Women appropriate. How about we give her a low kind of snood bun thing that comes off the back. I've drawn her face very roundy, which I like to do, but I'm going to sculpt out a little bit of that as well. And then I'll go ahead and suggest to myself that I'm going to make that dark, the hair. But again, that's something we'll cover. She looks a little bit like she's in Planet of the Apes right now. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and give it a button closure, maybe a little ruffle thing. And I'll suggest to myself that there are some tiny little buttons that bring it down to that waist point. Dress logic, which is not the same thing as talking about shadow placement, usually tells us that if there's a lot of gathering, for instance, in the way that pieces come together, that theme is probably carried out in other parts of the dress. So for instance, if I've got these soft little gathers here into the sleeve and at the wrist and at the waist and so on, it's not like I'm going to have pleats all of a sudden somewhere else, or something that's more architectural. So generally it's like a language, you know, if A sounds a certain way or their vowel sounds in a language, garments have that kind of logic. If there are pleats in one part, there are probably pleats in another part. If there's embroidery in one area, there's probably embroidery somewhere else. You don't have like sequins down here and fine, delicate ribbon lace up there, right? So there's like a logic to a dress, and it's like a self-contained little design project. So I'm gonna, with this yoke, which is like a piece that's used to fit things into a waist or sometimes into a shoulder. So you'll see it in menswear, like Western shirts. You will see it at the tops of pants and skirts to fit into a waist. Sometimes you'll see it on a blouse to fit into the waist and on a dress similarly. So they can be shaped a lot of different ways. I'm gonna let this be a little ruched and gathered piece as well. With maybe finer, tighter, and controlled gathers that comes across. So it's almost like a cummerbund. While I'm here, because I kind of left this unfinished, I'm going to resolve what's happening at the cuff of the sleeve. And I drew like soft little ruffles here and here. So the logic is that there'd be a similarly sized and proportioned ruffle at the wrist. There might even be something like that kind of here. You never know. I'm going to pause this right now because there's a corgi barking outside and I need to go let her in.